On the air everywhere, this is New England Broadcasting.
Come Monday, it'll be alright.
Monday morning, you sure look fine. Rainy days, Mondays always get me down.
Whatever.
Tell me why I don't like Mondays. Tell me why I don't like Mondays.
It's just another manic Monday.
Monday, so good to me.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. It's the Ron Van Dam Show.
Oh, thank you.
Hold on tight. Things can get a bit weird if you like that sort of thing.
Hey, thank you very much. Welcome to the program. It is the Ron Van Dam Show. I am Ron Van Dam. I've said my name twice already. So nice of you to drop by today. Thank you so much. It's the Monday edition of the program. Oh my goodness, what a show I have for you today. All right. Well, make yourself comfortable. I've got quite a ride for you today. This entire program is going to be devoted to my guest, who is author Rob Docters. He's not a doctor. It spells it differently, so he's not. If he spelled it the right way, he would be, but he's not. But he's an incredible author, and he's written a book about greed and all that stuff. My goodness, with the world kind of falling apart, as it tends to do on a regular basis, sometimes we look at, how does this happen? The answer is human beings. It's follow the money and human beings. And that's just the way of the world. And unfortunately, that's not a great thing. We're going to talk about that today, and we're going to do it right away because he's a fascinating man, and his book is incredibly fascinating as well. So let's say hello to Rob. Rob Docters joins us now. He's co-authored an incredible book, Ethics and Hidden Greed, Your Defense Against Unethical Strategies and Violations of Trust. It's a long title. It's almost half the book. But at least,
it's a short book by comparison.
Right. But at least we know what it's about. This is fascinating. You're a partner at Abbey Road, and you lead their ethics practice. What does Abbey Road do?
Well, we do a number of things. We started off as a pricing practice, so we help people price better. What I do today is we call ethical audits, because what it turns out is that a lot of companies have people doing things that aren't really ethical, and therefore are not conducive to the longer run loyalty to that company.
Interesting.
And I just look through it, and usually by listening carefully, I can pick up what's going wrong.
The magic word seems to be greed, and this is a difficult word, even politically. There's a lot of greed involved, but we're talking about business and business marketing, but I kind of expand your book to going further than that, to be honest with you.
Yeah, I mean, greed, unfortunately, is just a manifestation of the fact that most people either don't know what ethical behavior is or cast it aside. And by the way, the first part is surprising how many people don't really know what's ethical.
Good. When I was growing up, I don't know if we're in the same age group, but there was kind of a war on the establishment socially, and that all businesses were dirty, greedy, and dishonest, and they were going after truth and love and all that stuff. Well, that dissipated quickly. But the greed part seems to be coming back where we hadn't really dealt with that socially for quite some time, in my estimation.
Well, it's funny you should mention that, because there's one of the chapters in the book, as you may have seen, is called generational greed.
Mm-hmm.
And it's the proposition that different generations, the boomers, the millennials, etc., in a way behave unethically and in a greedy way towards adjoining generations.
Mm-hmm.
So, for instance, a lot of the millennials believe that they were shortchanged by our generation, and that has manifestations in terms of the environment, in terms of the economy, et cetera, et cetera. But interestingly enough, there's also ways in which they're right. So, for instance, part of that chapter is that in economics, it's well known that over time, you grow more productive as you stay on a job.
Mm-hmm.
So when you're first hired, you're not that productive, but you're still being paid something. So you're actually getting paid more than you're worth,
Right.
which is why it's actually hard to find a job initially.
I guess.
But over time, actually the inverse happens, that you suddenly your wages go up over time, and your productivity doesn't change that much. So you are now earning more than you should. What's interesting about this generationally is that there's basically a claim, and you see it in interviews in newspapers and such, that younger generations actually enter the workforce more productive than we do, because, and by we I mean I'm over 60,
Right.
So I haven't entered the workforce for a while, but
I
nonetheless, they enter the workforce with a much more capable regarding information technology.
Uh-huh.
In fact, as they look around, they see themselves as more capable than older people.
Yes.
So that is something that breeds resentment. Like, why am I not being paid what I'm worth? The result is behavior that looks greedy.
Huh. Is greed also a taste of greed? In other words, it's a drug. Like once you get something, you want more of it at any cost because you were able to do it before. Now I can build on that. It's almost like robbing a bank, like starting in a shoplifting and robbing a bank. Does it work like that?
Absolutely. There's the psychologists have been looking at greed for a while, and they noticed that it's in many ways like a habit, and a hard to break habit. Also, it's part of the broader sort of gestalt or ecosystem of being greedy. So, for instance, being given power, having some money, leads you to now expect more money. And there's a really interesting study somebody did, which was they had two groups of people, one who were wealthy people, one who were less wealthy people, wait in a room to be interviewed. And the real point of the whole thing was that there was a jar full of candy in the room. And what they said was, by the way, this candy's for some children who will be coming through later for something else. Yeah. Only take one. Well, it turns out all the people who identified as less wealthy only took one, if any. The wealthy people helped themselves to multiple candies, which I would call greedy.
Interesting. It's almost a political kind of statement, but not really, but maybe so. You could probably throw it into that area. But anyway, let's not do that. Yeah. So greed kind of equals to each his own. I mean, you get what you get, and if you don't stand up and fight, you're going to lose. Similar to a family of 8 at the dinner table. If you don't grab the food first, the rest ain't going to get it, as opposed to sharing it with the family. Yeah,
it's actually an expectation. There's a certain narcissism to greed.
Yes.
I'm entitled, therefore I get it.
Entitlement. All right. What do victims of greed have in common?
Frequently, it's lack of power, and it's a lack of doing things that would give them power.
Mm-hmm.
And even more commonly, it's a lack of awareness of what the greedy tend to do.
Mm.
So if you like, I can give you 3 examples, one for each of those cases.
Yeah.
Great. The first one, which is a lack of power, was very interesting. There was a article in several newspapers about how a certain football team's cheerleaders got flown to, I think it was Nicaragua. And once they were there, their passports were confiscated. And many of them were told to walk around topless because there were supporters of the team there.
Uh-huh.
And apparently, according to the newspaper, the women cried and were unhappy and felt victimized, but they didn't do anything.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a perfect example of where they behaved in a powerless fashion. And apparently something similar happened to another team, but there the ladies sued. So they're now at least wealthier for the miserable experience. So that's an example of knowing you can do something.
Interesting.
The other example so let me skip to the one that's broadest, which is you don't know when people are being greedy to you.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of people think intuition will help them, but it doesn't anymore. Greed has gotten more sophisticated, and things that were occasionally obvious when, in 100 years ago are not. Example, 100 years ago, actually 300 years ago, there was a baker in England, and he developed a system of cheating, greedy one, which was in those days you bought bread by the pound, not by the loaf. So people would say, I'd like a pound of bread, and he'd say, fine, and he'd take some dough and he'd put it on a scale, and yes, a pound, and then he would plop it on the counter. Well, there was a little boy under the counter, and there was a trap door in the counter. So, oh yes, and then the trap door opens, the kid reaches up, grabs a handful of dough, and the baker is a little wealthier. Not in the long run. He actually got caught, and in those days the penalties were pretty severe too. So they they dragged him through the streets and flogged him and hung him.
Oh, that's too bad.
That didn't happen to Apple, which did something very similar. There was a scandal, and they got fined $30 million in court that they were slowing down older iPhones.
Oh, yes, I remember this.
Yes, and their belief was that would lead you to go out and buy a new one.
Interesting. It's greed and scam can kind of go hand in hand, I assume, because there are plenty of scams going on right now. And let's talk about our sophistication in our society and how that has led to some more evil than we expected. We're getting into the artificial intelligence thing. I get robocalls all day. I can go through a whole day and not speak to a live human being and still have interactions. It scares the hell out of me, and I feel like I'm being accosted and stalked, etc. And it's all because of greed, I would assume.
Yeah, oddly enough, if you open a dictionary and you look up greed, it just says a unusual wanting or a desire for too much. I claim some of the dictionaries really should add something else, which is a willingness to do something wrong. A wrong act is something they're willing to do to obtain some material wealth. And the interesting thing about artificial intelligence is that it allows you to do greed in a different way. And that is, you can do many small grabs, if I can use that term, with artificial intelligence, and whereas they just wouldn't be worthwhile doing that in person. So, for instance, Facebook had its clientele robbed because they had an AI guy or machine that figured out what those people expected. And then when they got an email that appeared to be from Facebook, it looked exactly like they would expect it from Facebook.
Yes.
So it's one of the things that AI has done is it has made crime cheaper for the criminal.
Yes, and more automatic and less personal. I mean,
Yes.
you take like a telemarketer who calls me continually. If it's a human, I've got to go through this thing. Well, I don't want to hang up on them. It's just a job that they took. They probably don't have much money, but yet they're trying to scam me or weasel me into things, telling me we're returning your call. No, you never called me. I never showed interest. All that. If it's an AI thing, I can get like 20 times more of those, and I can just hang up on them. But I'm bombarded.
Yeah, and it's unfortunate that often law and other ways that you can curb these kinds of behavior lags behind the actual behavior.
Always.
Yes, and what's interesting is that you've got. That's actually, believe it or not, a fairly benign example of AI. The worst example is that there have been studies that have been shown that games that have warriors and monsters and stuff in them, the people who play them are much more prone to breaking the law later.
I would assume, yes, because they're vicariously taking on that ethical emotion, unethical emotion.
Exactly.
Right.
And there's no consequences whatsoever for the people programming that.
Right. Interesting. Oh, boy. Have you personally ever been the victim of greed?
Well, many times, actually. When someone has said they would do something and they either did it but charged a lot more, or they didn't do everything they were supposed to. So, yeah, it's interesting. We did a survey of about 5,000 people, and it turned out that 92% of the respondents said that they had been a victim of greed. Interestingly enough, in a follow-on question in our survey, we asked, what's the nature of it? And one of the answers was not sure. And a vast majority of people weren't sure how they had been taken advantage of.
Interesting.
And therefore, one of the things I think that has happened is greed has gotten much more sophisticated. The book outlines there's 5 different forms of greed. And by the way, most people don't even understand that there are 5 forms, and that's what they need to be looking for. But some of them are very hard to spot. So, for instance, there's something called placing an agent. And example, what headhunters will do is they will say, okay, thank you, Mr. Company. We're supposed to hire the person who's best at these attributes. But they not necessarily do that. They hire somewhat younger people because they've found that once they place somebody and then she needs to hire her team, they will go back to them and fill in the rest of them. So this is an example where the company has no way of knowing what candidates got turned down because they were a little too old, even though we were better candidates, and they chose the, for them, more profitable candidate.
Interesting. Wow. What does the average person do to protect themselves against acts of greed?
Well, sort of 2 answers. One is you need to know what the forms of greed are. And you can't do this intuitively, for instance. One of the other categories is capturing the language. And what's happened is the incumbent suntan lotion manufacturers have patented the word suntan and sunblock.
Yes.
So if you want to start up, Ron's suntan lotion company, you can't put that word on the bottle, even if you have a better suntan lotion than the ones that are existing. So you need to know that word is not essential to you looking at the suntan lotions, and surprise, the ones that have that word, because it's been patented and protected, are more expensive, and the ones that don't tend to be less expensive.
Ah.
But if you don't know that going in, you might say, copper tone suntan lotion. Yes, that's got to be the choice.
Well, I would think that. I would think if it didn't say suntan lotion, it wasn't suntan lotion.
No, and best of all, your tax dollars are helping defend the greed.
Of course.
As they do in a number of ways, by the way. But
that's normal.
in this case, the FDA has declared 5 ingredients, which happen to be the 5 ingredients that the incumbent suntan lotion companies use and have patented. And if you don't have those 5 ingredients, they also object to the word suntan lotion. And it's their lawyers who will tap you on the shoulder saying, hey, can't use that word, Ron. Noting, by the way, in Europe, there's over 20 different ingredients that the Europeans say are effective against suntan lotion. But here, the FDA, probably by listening to certain people, has decided only 5 are.
Well, there goes my suntan lotion company. That's exactly what I had in mind. All right, so
You
much for
overspent, my friend.
that. Yeah, tell me about that. This book is fascinating. Just it opens your mind up. I mean, as you were talking before, what has been your reaction? Everybody should ask themselves when they realize that they were a victim of greed. How did they handle that? Did you just walk away and say, no, whatever? Or did you do something about it? Very interesting, because we have to live in this stuff, don't we?
Sadly, greed has evolved over time. It used to be pretty simple, and it's grown more sophisticated. So now you have forms of greed that include stealing the language, like we mentioned with the suntan lotion, and there's other examples. One of them is hiding an agent in what they do. There's just a whole range of these particular strategies that most people don't look for.
Yeah.
And
well,
if you don't look for it, you don't see it.
Yeah, I mean, that word ethical and unethical, they really go hand in hand. So does greed and power and egotism. I mean, they kind of all lump, don't they?
Yes, and the power is, by the way, often manifested. That is one thing you can look for, by the way, is a network. So when you look at, say, and by the way, lust could be argued to be a form of greed in some circumstances. Yeah. If you look at the Harvey Weinsteins of the world, the truth is he had friends. He had people helping him. And that's why an individual woman would be relatively hard-pressed to defend unless she knew she was getting into that greedy, evil network.
Yeah. Network's very interesting. I call it the Michael Jackson syndrome, even though Michael Jackson wasn't necessarily in a network, but he was surrounded by an entire community of people constantly that said yes to him and agreed with everything that he did and everything he wanted to do. And you totally lose a connection with reality. And that's a festering of that bacteria, I guess.
Yeah, I agree. Unfortunately, I'm not sure I'd agree with the word touch with reality. That is a reality. It's an ugly one. It's one we'd like to eradicate, but it is probably a reality.
Yeah, one I wouldn't like to have a reality. Now we're dealing with falsehoods and lying and calling that the truth. And now we're walking around, well, is that true or not? I don't know. It depends on who told you, where you heard it, and when you heard it. I mean, it's like, wow, that's not what I remember when I was growing up. It was true or not. But not the case now. People are a little confused here. All of this.
It's tough because we all grew up and we were taught certain values, and in my case, I'll acknowledge one or two of them were wrong, but most of them I think were right. And if you just sort of fast forward to succeeding generations, there's less and less that they're learning as values because the world has, in some ways, conflict averse. So instead of being told, you will go right on red, only, now it's, you need to avoid the general traffic and that sort of thing. It's interesting because the misrepresentation, which you alluded to earlier, it's not crystal clear always what what is a misrepresentation? And one of the ways that happens is that people, instead of focusing on the dollars, every transaction is $1 for a good or $1 for a service, they now focus on playing games with the service or the good, not on the dollars. So, the classic example, which I'm sure you've run across, is that when J&J decided to make more money on their dental floss, they reduced the length of the dental floss that went into a $3 package.
Yeah. And now that's a standard practice.
Yes, it is exactly
all over the place, and the word trust and mistrust comes into play, which I found as I got older. There was more mistrusting going on than trust when I was a child, but at the same time, you cannot take somebody at their face value anymore. You have to look, think, and evaluate, and that's also a shame. But I guess it's part of society.
Yeah, although I will say this. You can get a certain way when you recognize that trust comes in two forms. And it's important to know which one you're dealing with. There's one I call a narrow trust and one I call a broad trust. So what's a narrow trust? A narrow trust is that when you deal with someone, there's a specific proposition you're putting forward, and that other person is going to reciprocate and want something themselves. And there's some amazing examples of that. So, for instance, in World War II, in the Battle of Stalingrad, where the Germans had only one purpose and the Russians had only one purpose, which was to kill each other, there was an article in a veterans magazine about a guy who was fighting the Germans, and he was on the bottom floor of a building, and the Germans still held on the upper floors. And what would happen was, apparently, that the Germans, I don't know how this was quite arranged, he didn't say that, but the Germans would lower a bowl, and it would be full of cigarettes. And then the Russians would take the cigarettes and fill it with water, because apparently the Germans were short on water, and the Germans would raise the water. And they traded cigarettes for water for quite a while. That's not that, there was a broad trust on either side, but for this specific transaction, they were willing to trust each other. On the other hand, you have, say, Mother Teresa, who isn't making a specific proposition, but probably is a trustworthy person.
Probably.
And you need to know which you're dealing with.
I could talk to you for a longer period of time, but then nobody would read the book, and we want them to read the book, and there's a lot more to it than what we've scratched the surface with here. So the book's available everywhere. It has been released, is that right?
No, it's about to be in a week or two.
Okay, great. So Ethics and Hidden Greed, Your Defense Against Unethical Strategies and Violations of Trust, and it's Rob Docters, and you co-authored with Hans, I understand?
Yes, I did. He, for instance, there's a chapter in there that talks about greed in the boardroom, and since he's been CEO of half a dozen companies,
he should know.
Monster,
right.
LexisNexis, Houghton Mifflin. He wrote out the sort of things that he sees in front of him when he's a chairman.
Pretty good.
Great.
Hopefully we'll talk again. Rob Docters, he's a co-author, Ethics and Hidden Greed, Your Defense Against Unethical Strategies and Violations of Trust. Thank you so much for your time today.
Thank you, Ron. Take care.
Take care. All right. Well, that'll do it for me today. Pick up his book. It is fascinating, and I could have talked to him for hours, but I'm not allowed to do that. And I don't really, you can't do that. You just can't do that. All right. That's the end of the program for today because we are indeed out of time. But I'll be back again tomorrow with a brand new program. Hope you join me then. It'll be more of the regular thing. So there you go. Take care of yourself. Be good. And I wish you peace.